I submitted my resignation letter on a Tuesday morning. I placed it directly in Reginald's hands, not on his desk, not in his inbox, in his actual hands. He glanced at the envelope, raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow, and slid it under a stack of proposals, without breaking eye contact. "Something you'd like to discuss, Anita?" he asked, voice dripping with condescension. "It's all explained in the letter," I replied, maintaining the professional tone I'd practiced all weekend. Reginald nodded distractedly, already reaching for his ringing phone. "I'll get to it when I have time." That moment crystallized everything wrong with Evergreen Conservation Initiative. 6 years of dedication reduced to an inconvenience he'd address when he had time. 2 weeks passed. My notice period expired without acknowledgement. No exit interview scheduled. No mention of replacement. Nothing. I approached his office again, knocking twice before entering. Reginald sat bathed in the morning light, tapping at his keyboard. "Excuse me," I said. "Today marks 2 weeks since my resignation. I wanted to confirm my departure date." He leaned back, linking his fingers beneath his chin. "Let's be honest with each other, Anita. We both know this little performance is nothing but attention-seeking. Where exactly would you go?" Heat rushed to my face. "The Prescott grant needs finalizing by next month. The Riverside project data requires analysis. The Wetlands Initiative is entering phase 2. He waved dismissively. "Return to your desk. We'll pretend this momentary lapse in judgment never happened." That afternoon, I visited Human Resources. Diane, the HR manager, shuffled papers nervously as I explained my situation. "He told us you're just seeking attention," she whispered, unable to meet my eyes. His exact instructions were to ignore her completely. "That's not acceptable," I said, voice steady despite my racing heart. "My resignation is legitimate and requires processing." Diane glanced toward the door. "Look, between us, Reginald holds significant influence with the board. If he's decided not to acknowledge your resignation..." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by binders of project data I'd accumulated over 6 years, conservation initiatives I'd designed, grant applications I'd written, progress reports showing my unmistakable methodology, all bearing other people's names. So I made a decision. The next morning, I arrived at work 30 minutes early. I positioned my laptop, organized my desk, and began working with unnerving calm. Colleagues exchanged puzzled glances as days passed without comment from me about my ignored resignation. In meetings, Reginald continued his usual performance. "What about trying community engagement through local schools?" I suggested during our weekly strategy session. "That's impractical," Reginald dismissed immediately. 10 minutes later, he leaned forward. "I've been considering a grassroots approach, perhaps connecting with educational institutions to boost community involvement." As others nodded appreciatively, I simply typed notes, documenting every instance, with timestamp and attendees. After one donor presentation where my slide deck was presented as his work, Reginald cornered me in the hallway. "This resignation theater stops now," he hissed. "Nobody's irreplaceable, especially not you." For 6 weeks, I performed my duties with precision. No objections, no complaints, just methodical, focused determination. I arrived first, left last, maintained meticulous records of every conversation, every email, every project development. On my self-designated final day, I composed a second email, not just to Reginald but to the entire board of directors and major donors. I hit send, then calmly packed my personal items. 20 minutes later, shouting erupted from the conference room. Reginald burst through the doors, face ashen. "She's being ridiculous," he stammered to the gathering crowd of concerned board members, but his hands visibly trembled as he clutched his phone. If this story resonates with you so far, please tap that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of people standing up for themselves in unexpected ways. Your comments fuel these narratives. What would you have done in this situation? My name is Anita Mercer. Most people describe me as meticulous, patient, and reserved. I graduated with honors in environmental science and spent 2 years in field research before joining Evergreen Conservation Initiative. At 34, I'd built a reputation among actual conservationists as someone who translated complicated ecological concepts into actionable plans. What most didn't realize was how I'd been slowly disappearing within the organization I helped build. It started subtly during my second year. A suggestion mentioned privately to Reginald would resurface in his presentations. Small edits to methodology would appear in final reports without acknowledgement. By year 3, entire grant proposals I'd drafted were submitted with other names listed as authors. You're not a team player, Reginald explained during my 4th-year evaluation, where my promotion was denied despite exceeding all metrics. You focus too much on individual recognition rather than organizational success. The irony wasn't lost on me. The breaking point came 6 weeks before my resignation. The Lakeside Watershed Project, my most ambitious initiative, received national recognition. I watched from the audience as Reginald and Patricia, his protege, accepted the award for Innovative Methodology in Community-Based Conservation. That evening, at the celebration dinner, I overheard Patricia in the bathroom. Between us, she whispered to someone, Anita actually designed most of it, but she's terrible with presentation. Reginald says she's too analytical for leadership. I stood frozen in the stall, a strange calm settling over me. 6 years of diminishment crystallized into perfect clarity. I wasn't invisible because I lacked skill. I was invisible because my visibility threatened Reginald's carefully constructed narrative. The resignation letter took 3 drafts: professional, succinct, without emotion. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately. I hand-delivered it the next day. When it became clear they intended to ignore my resignation, something shifted inside me. Not anger, something colder, more calculated. If they wouldn't acknowledge my departure, they would certainly notice my absence once I was gone. For those 6 weeks, I created the most comprehensive transition documentation possible, except I shared it with no one. I organized 6 years of institutional knowledge into detailed files. I recorded every instance where my work had been claimed by others. I compiled data showing the actual status of projects versus what was being reported to donors. Most crucially, I documented how Reginald had been systematically misrepresenting project outcomes to maintain funding streams. The Prescott grant claimed 80% completion when barely 40% of milestones had been met. The Riverside data showed declining water quality despite reports of improvement. The Wetlands Initiative Phase 1 had failed to establish baseline measurements, making Phase 2 evaluations meaningless. Throughout those weeks, colleagues noticed my changed demeanor. Are you okay? Melanie from accounting asked during lunch. You seem different lately. I found clarity, I replied simply. 3 weeks in, Reginald called me into his office. The board is impressed with your recent reports, he said, leaning back in his chair. Perhaps we should discuss your future here. Maybe that management track you've been wanting. I simply nodded. That would be a conversation worth having. His eyes narrowed slightly at my lack of enthusiasm, but he quickly recovered. Good. We'll schedule something soon. I knew soon would never come. It was the same carrot he'd dangled for years. That evening, I received a call from Zachary Bennett, director of the Regional Environmental Commission. 3 months earlier, I'd applied for their oversight position, a role specifically focused on grant compliance across 3 states. We'd like to offer you the position, Zachary said. Your experience with grant implementation makes you uniquely qualified to oversee compliance. The irony wasn't lost on me. I accepted immediately. When can you start? He asked. In exactly 3 weeks, I replied, my self-imposed final day. As my last day approached, tension built inside me like a gathering storm. Would my plan work? Would anyone actually read the email? Would it matter? The night before, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my documentation one last time. Everything was factual, unemotional, and damning in its precision. I wasn't making accusations. I was simply presenting reality. My final morning at Evergreen, I arrived early as usual. I completed my remaining tasks, sent my farewell email with all attachments, and began packing my desk. 20 minutes later, chaos erupted as board members rushed into the building for an emergency meeting. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I watched Reginald gesturing wildly, his typical composure shattered. Patricia approached my desk, eyes wide. What did you do? She whispered. I smiled genuinely for the first time in months. I resigned. Within minutes, Diane from HR appeared at my desk, looking panicked. The board wants to see you immediately, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My resignation was effective today, I replied, placing my company keycard on the desk. I'm no longer an employee. Please, Anita, she pleaded. They're insisting. I nodded and followed her to the conference room where 8 board members sat around the table, faces grim. Reginald stood at the head, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. Board Chair Eleanor Walsh looked up from her tablet. Miss Mercer, would you care to explain this? My email was comprehensive, I replied calmly. It includes all relevant documentation. These are serious allegations, said Trevor, the finance director. They're not allegations, I corrected. They're documented facts. Every spreadsheet, progress report, and timeline comparison comes directly from our own systems. Reginald slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. She's trying to sabotage us because she wasn't promoted. The lakeside watershed data, Eleanor continued as if he hadn't spoken, shows significantly different outcomes than what was presented at the national conference. Yes, I acknowledged. The presentation claimed 92% improvement in water quality. Actual measurements show 43%. That's within standard deviation parameters. Reginald interjected desperately. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on me. And the Prescott grant? 3 months behind schedule with 4 unmet deliverables, despite reports to funders indicating completion. The room fell silent as board members scrolled through attachments on their devices. Each document was meticulously organized: original proposal, promised deliverables, actual status, and communication history showing repeated concerns raised and dismissed. Why didn't you bring this to our attention earlier? Trevor asked. I tilted my head slightly. I attempted to. 6 weeks ago, I submitted my resignation letter directly to Reginald, expecting a transition that would have included status updates on all projects. That letter was ignored. All eyes turned to Reginald, who had grown increasingly pale. I approached human resources, I continued. I was told Reginald had instructed them to ignore my resignation because I was just seeking attention. Diane, standing by the door, looked at the floor. So I spent the past 6 weeks creating this documentation to ensure the organization had accurate information about project statuses after my departure. I concluded. This is character assassination, Reginald exploded. She's always been difficult, always thinking she deserves more recognition. Recognition for work I actually did? I asked quietly. Like the lakeside methodology that won the national award? Eleanor exchanged glances with several board members. Miss Mercer, would you step outside for a moment? I nodded and walked out, closing the door behind me. Through the glass, I could see animated discussion, Reginald gesturing wildly, while Eleanor repeatedly pointed at something on her tablet. Colleagues gathered in clusters, whispering and staring. Patricia approached again. Is it true? She asked. About the lakeside project. You know it is, I replied. You were in the bathroom that night when you told someone I designed it. Her face flushed. I didn't think anyone. That's been the problem all along, I said. No one thought I was listening, or watching, or documenting. The conference room door opened, and Eleanor emerged. Miss Mercer, we'd like to discuss the possibility of you remaining with the organization, perhaps in a more senior capacity. I smiled politely. I appreciate the offer, but I've accepted a position elsewhere. Today is still my last day. Her eyebrows rose. May I ask where? The Regional Environmental Commission. I'll be starting as their new oversight director for grant compliance next week. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. The commission controlled millions in environmental funding across 3 states, including every major grant Evergreen depended upon. I see, she said carefully. Perhaps we should discuss how to maintain a positive relationship moving forward. Absolutely, I replied. Compliance and transparency will be my top priorities in the new role. Behind her, I could see Reginald watching through the glass, his expression shifting from anger to dawning horror. By noon, I had cleared my desk. No dramatic confrontations, no tearful goodbyes. A few colleagues stopped by with awkward well wishes, clearly uncertain what was happening. Most avoided eye contact entirely. As I walked to the elevator carrying my small box of personal items, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. You planned this, Reginald hissed, catching up. All of it. No, I replied, pressing the down button. You created this situation. I simply documented it. They'll never believe you over me, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The elevator doors opened. That's the beauty of documentation, Reginald. It doesn't matter what anyone believes. The numbers speak for themselves. As the doors closed between us, his expression remained seared in my memory. The look of someone who finally understood they weren't the smartest person in the room. The weekend passed in strange serenity. 6 years of emotional investment had transformed into something else. Not detachment exactly, but perspective. Monday morning, I walked into the Regional Environmental Commission's offices for my first day. Zachary Bennett greeted me warmly. Welcome aboard, Anita. The team is excited to have someone with your project experience. My new office was smaller than Reginald's, but had large windows overlooking the river. On my desk sat a nameplate, Anita Mercer, Director of Compliance. We've had some concerns about grant implementation at several organizations, Zachary explained during orientation. Your role will include auditing current projects and establishing stronger accountability frameworks. Any particular organizations flagging concerns? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated. Several, but Evergreen Conservation Initiative tops the list. Their reporting has been inconsistent lately. I nodded. I'm familiar with their work. That's partly why we hired you. Your insider knowledge will be valuable, though of course, you'll need to recuse yourself from direct evaluations due to conflict of interest. Of course, I agreed, but I can certainly help develop the evaluation criteria. By my third week at the commission, I had established new compliance protocols requiring organizations to provide original data alongside progress reports. All staff concerns now required written acknowledgement within 48 hours. Anonymous reporting channels were strengthened. None of these changes targeted Evergreen specifically. They applied to all grant recipients, but I knew exactly which organization would struggle most with this new transparency. 2 months into my role, rumors circulated about leadership changes at Evergreen. Eleanor called me directly, her tone carefully cordial. I wanted to inform you personally, she said. We're implementing structural changes following an internal review. Reginald has been asked to step down, effective immediately. I see, I replied neutrally. We're committed to addressing the discrepancies in our reporting, she continued. I hope we can count on fair treatment from the Commission during this transition. The Commission evaluates all organizations by the same standards, I assured her. Compliance isn't punitive, it's protective, for the environments we serve and the organizations themselves. After hanging up, I allowed myself a single moment of satisfaction before returning to work. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about accountability. 3 months after my departure, Evergreen underwent what their press release called a strategic leadership restructuring. Reginald was gone. 2 board members resigned. Patricia had been demoted. The following week, their latest grant application crossed my desk. I reviewed it carefully before stamping it with the designation All Incomplete Applications Received. Additional verification required. The system I'd created wasn't designed to punish Evergreen. It was designed to protect all stakeholders from people like Reginald. The truth was, I didn't need revenge. I needed change. And now I was positioned to ensure it happened. As I worked late that evening, Zachary stopped by my office. The new compliance frameworks are impressive, he said, already seeing better reporting from multiple organizations. That's good to hear. He leaned against the doorframe. Some people were concerned you might be too harsh with Evergreen given your history there. I looked up from my computer. My interest isn't in being harsh or lenient. It's in ensuring conservation projects actually deliver what they promise. The environments we're trying to protect don't care about office politics. He nodded approvingly. That's exactly why you were the right choice for this position. After he left, I opened my desk drawer and removed the copy of my original resignation letter, the one Reginald had ignored 6 weeks before finally reading my email. I'd kept it as a reminder. I no longer needed it. I dropped it in the recycling bin and turned back to the application before me, another organization whose projects needed proper evaluation. The work continued, more important than any personal vindication. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Our revised application is ready for submission. We hope for a fair review. I texted back one word, guaranteed. And it was true. Fair was all I'd ever wanted. Fair recognition, fair treatment, fair evaluation. In the end, the most satisfying revenge wasn't destroying Reginald or Evergreen. It was creating a system where people like him couldn't succeed through manipulation, and people like me couldn't be silenced. 6 months into my role at the Commission, I received an unexpected visitor. Melanie from Evergreen's accounting department sat nervously in my waiting area, clutching her purse. I wasn't sure if you'd see me, she said when I invited her into my office. Why wouldn't I asked, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She glanced at the closed door. Things at Evergreen are not good. In what way? I kept my expression neutral despite my curiosity. After you left, they brought in someone named Gregory to replace Reginald. He's different, very corporate, always talking about streamlining operations and optimizing resource allocation. She lowered her voice. Last week, they laid off 3 project managers. This was unexpected. I thought with the leadership changes, things would improve. That's what we all thought. Melanie twisted the strap of her purse. But it's worse now. Gregory's cutting corners everywhere to make up for funding shortfalls. He says we need to rebuild credibility after the previous administration's mismanagement, but his methods. She trailed off. What about your projects? The ones I documented? That's why I'm here. She pulled a flash drive from her purse and placed it on my desk. They're falsifying data again, but differently. Instead of inflating success, they're manipulating baseline measurements to make future improvements look more significant. I stared at the flash drive. Melanie, you realize giving me this could cost you your job? I know. Her resolve surprised me. But after what you did, standing up to Reginald, some of us started asking questions, looking closer at reports. This isn't what I signed up for. After she left, I examined the files. She was right. The new leadership was employing more sophisticated methods of deception, but the intent was identical: mislead donors about project outcomes. I thought I'd solved the problem by exposing Reginald, but I'd only addressed a symptom. The disease ran deeper. The following week, I received a lunch invitation from Eleanor. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, far from both our offices. I wanted to thank you personally, she said after we ordered. Your documentation forced necessary changes at Evergreen. I'm hearing those changes might not be for the better, I replied carefully. Her smile tightened. Growing pains. Gregory comes highly recommended from the corporate conservation sector. Is that what Evergreen is now? Corporate conservation? Eleanor sighed. The board feels we need to rebuild donor confidence. Gregory understands how to position our work appealingly, even if that positioning isn't entirely accurate. Her eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying? I maintained eye contact. Just that accurate reporting was supposedly the reason for the leadership change. It would be unfortunate if that commitment wavered. The commission seems particularly stringent with our applications lately, she said, changing tactics. 3 additional verification requests in 2 months. All applications receive equal scrutiny, I replied. Of course, Eleanor nodded, unconvinced. You know, Gregory has connections at the state level. He's suggested bringing concerns about potential bias in the commission's evaluation process. The threat hung between us. I took a sip of water. That would certainly be his prerogative, I said finally. Just as it's the commission's prerogative to conduct random site audits of projects showing unusual data patterns. Eleanor's fork paused midway to her mouth. Site audits? A new initiative I've implemented. Teams conduct unannounced visits to verify reported conditions match reality. I smiled. Transparency works best when it goes both ways, don't you think? She didn't answer, but the message was received. Back at my office, I found Zachary waiting. Everything okay? You seem troubled. I closed the door. I need to discuss something sensitive. For the next hour, I explained my concerns about Evergreen's new direction, carefully avoiding mentioning Melanie or the flash drive. Instead, I presented it as patterns my department had identified through routine analysis. Zachary listened intently. If you're right, this goes beyond one organization. It could indicate systemic problems in how conservation outcomes are measured and reported. Exactly, I agreed. Which is why I'd like to propose something broader than individual organization audits. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a comprehensive reform proposal, the Conservation Accountability Initiative. Rather than targeting specific organizations, it would establish new industry standards for transparent reporting, including standardized measurement protocols, independent verification requirements, and protection for staff raising compliance concerns. This is ambitious, Zachary said, reviewing my proposal. Implementation would affect every organization in our jurisdiction. That's the point, I explained. Targeting individual organizations creates defensiveness. Industry-wide standards create a level playing field. He studied me carefully. Some might see this as overreach. Others might see it as necessary evolution, I countered. These are public funds being allocated based on promised environmental outcomes. Shouldn't we ensure those promises are kept? After considerable debate, the Commission approved a pilot program. Organizations could voluntarily adopt the new standards for 1 grant cycle, with incentives for early adoption. The day after the announcement, Gregory himself appeared at my office without an appointment. The Conservation Accountability Initiative, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Quite the power grab. I see it as power distribution, I replied, putting more verification capability in the hands of communities affected by these projects. He smiled without warmth. Eleanor mentioned your lunch. She thought you might be targeting Evergreen specifically, but I assured her you wouldn't be so unprofessional. The initiative applies equally to all organizations. Indeed, he leaned forward. But we both know its origins, don't we? A disgruntled former employee using her new position to settle scores. I met his gaze steadily. The initiative was unanimously approved by the Commission Board based on its merits. Nothing in it specifically disadvantages Evergreen unless accuracy itself is considered a disadvantage. He chuckled. You're good. I see why Reginald found you threatening. He stood to leave. Evergreen won't be participating in your voluntary pilot. We'll wait until the kinks are worked out. After he left, I received an email from Zachary. The state environmental secretary, a close friend of Gregory's, had expressed concerns about the commission's new initiative. Political pressure was mounting. I had miscalculated. By creating a program that could genuinely improve industry practices, I'd made powerful enemies beyond Evergreen. Organizations comfortable with the status quo were aligning against change. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by files, feeling an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu. Had I simply traded one unwinnable battle for another? My phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Is this Anita Mercer? A woman's voice asked. Speaking. My name is Josephine Winters. I'm a reporter with the Regional Chronicle. I'm working on a story about transparency in environmental grant funding and heard about your accountability initiative. Would you be willing to discuss it? I hesitated. Any comment would need clearance from our communications department. Of course, she said. But off the record, I'm particularly interested in how organizations might be manipulating baseline data to exaggerate project outcomes. A source suggested you might have insights. My heart raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Either Melanie had approached the press, or someone else had. Either way, this was the moment where I chose my path. I can't comment on specific organizations, I said carefully. But hypothetically speaking, baseline manipulation is unfortunately common and difficult to detect without site verification, which is why your initiative includes unannounced site visits, among other safeguards. Interesting. She paused. I understand there's resistance to these measures. Any comment on that? Innovation often faces resistance, I said, especially when it challenges established patterns. After hanging up, I sat motionless, thinking. Josephine was clearly working with inside information. But what was her angle? Was this a trap set by Gregory, or an opportunity? The next morning, Zachary called me into his office. The Secretary of Environmental Affairs wants us to pause the accountability initiative for review. On what grounds? Concerns about undue regulatory burden on organizations. He looked troubled. There's pressure, Anita. Significant pressure. So we're abandoning it? I didn't say that. He closed his office door. But we need to be strategic. The commission exists within a political ecosystem. I understood his position. What if we had public support? Would that change the equation? He raised an eyebrow. Possibly. But conservation policy rarely generates public passion. Unless there's a scandal, I suggested. Zachary's expression grew cautious. Tread carefully, Anita. Very carefully. 2 days later, the Regional Chronicle published its front-page investigation. Numbers game. How conservation organizations manipulate data to secure millions in public funding. The article didn't mention Evergreen by name, but it detailed precisely the pattern of baseline manipulation Melanie had documented. It quoted anonymous sources from multiple organizations describing similar tactics. It highlighted the Commission's accountability initiative as a potential solution facing political resistance. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Environmental advocates, other journalists, even 2 state representatives wanted statements. Zachary appeared at my door. The secretary is livid. About the initiative or the practices it would prevent? I asked. Both. He handed me his tablet. On the screen, 3 other regional newspapers had picked up the story. Social media was erupting with outrage about misused environmental funds. The commission needs to respond, I said. This is an opportunity to demonstrate leadership. Zachary studied me. You know something about this article's timing, don't you? I met his gaze steadily. I know that journalism serves an essential function in a democracy. He almost smiled. I've scheduled an emergency board meeting for 3 o'clock. They want you to present the initiative again, with specific responses to the practices described in the article. By week's end, public pressure had transformed the political landscape. Organizations began voluntarily signing up for the accountability initiative, eager to demonstrate their commitment to transparency. The secretary's concerns mysteriously evaporated, and then came the call I'd been both expecting and dreading. We'd like to discuss Evergreen's participation in the initiative, Eleanor said, her voice tight. Of course, I replied. The Commission welcomes all organizations committed to transparent reporting. Gregory has decided to pursue other opportunities, she continued. The board feels Evergreen needs leadership more aligned with current industry best practices. I said nothing, waiting. We'd like to discuss the possibility of you returning, she finally said, as executive director. And there it was, the revenge fantasy I'd never actually had, the triumphant return, the professional vindication, the complete circle. I'm honored by the offer, I said carefully, but my work at the Commission isn't finished. The salary would be substantially increased from your previous position, she pressed, and you'd have complete authority to implement whatever accountability measures you deem appropriate. It's not about the position or compensation, Eleanor. It's about creating systemic change. One organization reforming isn't enough. After we hung up, I sat in my office watching the sunset over the river. The accountability initiative was gaining momentum daily. Organizations were adopting new transparency standards. The Commission had approved funding for a dedicated verification team. My revenge wasn't returning to Evergreen as its leader. It wasn't even watching Reginald and Gregory fall from grace. My revenge was changing the system that enabled them in the first place. The following Monday, I received a notification that Evergreen had submitted a new application under interim leadership. Attached was a note, fully compliant with accountability initiative standards. We hope this marks a new beginning. I reviewed the application carefully. The data was conservative but honest. The timeline realistic. The methodology sound. I stamped it, approved for consideration. Some might call it anticlimactic. No dramatic confrontation. No public humiliation for those who wronged me. But I had achieved something far more satisfying. I had made it impossible for the next Anita to be silenced. I had created a system where merit actually mattered. And that was vengeance enough. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more narratives about transformation and justice. Have you ever changed a system instead of just fighting within it? Share your experiences in the comments. Your stories inspire these conversations and remind us all that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't personal destruction, but systematic reform that lifts everyone. Thank you for listening.